Hello everyone and welcome to the Year of Underrated Stephen King podcast. My name is Kim C and I am the host of this one-woman Stephen King book podcast with an emphasis on the literary, as I am a university fiction teacher who loves the writing of Stephen King and sharing the brilliance of said writing with practically everyone I come into contact with. And today, sweet people, we're stepping into senior level constant reader coursework with a conversation on a criminally underrated King title that has really won me over after this second read-through. For those of you who have followed the show since the dusty, rusty, crusty beginnings of 2020, I read 1995's Rose Madder for the first time that year and did my very best to compile my thoughts into a bumpy episode 29 to be exact, that attempted to explore what the heck is going on with that wonderfully weird domestic abuse survival narrative with a ginormous insertion of magical realism and mythological symbolism. I was really smitten, albeit totally confused after that first read-through, so I was thrilled when 2025 allowed for a Rose Madder revisit. A lot of you know that in my pretty much non-existent free time, I do have some wiggle room to moderate a Stephen King book club. This is our third year as a club, and this year's theme is the Dark Ladies of Stephen King. For February 2025's novel pick, I decided to give everyone in the club a dark valentine from a woman named Rosie McClendon Daniels. This was a risky move. I was very nervous after the fact and pretty convinced everyone was going to hate it, even the veterans who had read it previously. I provided a ton of trigger warnings, lots of buyer bewares, and advised all readers they could skip whatever passages they liked because we have some trauma with a capital T, traumatizing content within that is not for the faint of heart. But alas, all the readers in the club were brave and eager to find out what was going to happen to little Rosie Reel, who literally ran for her life to find safety and a new beginning and accidentally finds redemption and a little revenge in another world. Rose Madder, it's amazing, folks, truly. As I was in the middle of my Valentine's month and my Rose Madder reread, my lovely constant reader friend, Irish horror author Jamie Stewart, reached out to talk about his new book, and bingo! I knew I had to have Jamie be my friend on the show and talk about Rose Madder with me. I asked Jamie if he was interested, and he said, "Why, yes, I'll grab my copy right now and start reading it," and off we went. What we have today for everyone is a conversation that deeply explores the ins, outs, overs, unders, and throughs of 1995's Rose Madder. There are spoilers everywhere, so please be warned. There are also moderate, slight spoilers of a kind where Jamie and I jump some bridges and discuss other King works that spiral off of Rose Madder, such as Misery, Desperation, Lisey's Story, and From a Buick 8. Although looking back on our conversation, I don't think there are too many specific spoilerific moments for those titles, but overall, this is, ladies and gentlemen, constant reader territory. So please tread carefully if you've never read the aforementioned titles. But yes, my friend Jamie Stewart is such a Stephen King whiz kid. I love this gentleman so much. I love his perspective, his impressive King readership, and keen insight on not only the story itself, but his ability to step back and incorporate even more integral and unseen details from King's writing development and career as a whole. It works so well, guys. It's a perfectly layered sandwich of analytical awesomeness. If you want a little bit of a refresh or an introduction to Mr. Jamie Stewart, jump back to episodes 88 and 94, as Jamie was a constant reader interview guest who did a 2-part interview with me. In those episodes, you'll learn about Jamie's history with King, his impressive constant reader skill set, his unique King favorites, as well as learn about his published horror works, Something Wicked, Something Dark, Montague's Carnival of Delights and Terror, Price Manor, The House That Bleeds, and I Hear the Clattering of the Keys and Other Fever Dreams, as well as his latest release, The Cult of Krisha. Oh my gosh, I had to look this one up. It's an Irish word. I think I'm definitely butchering the pronunciation. I'm so sorry, Jamie, don't kill me, I'm sorry. And now, good people of the podcast, let's discuss an ultra punk rock 90s king title that goes hard, stays weird, and brings the blood, bruises, roses, mythology, revenge, and the dark feminine. This is 1995's Rose Matter with my friend, constant reader, and horror author, Jamie Stewart. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back my good friend, Jamie Stewart, back to the Year of Underrated Stephen King podcast. Hi, Jamie.
Hello, Kim. Thank you for having me. It's great to be back.
It's so nice to see you. I'm so excited to be with you and chat King with you. You are one of my favorite people to chat King with. I just don't think anybody has touched the amount of... You're way up there, Jamie, in terms of knowledge, expertise, the amount of times you've read King's catalog. It's impressive.
I don't know. I have a lot of time in my hands, I suppose.
For those who are listening who might not have heard the first time you were on the show, can you give us a little background into your personal history with King?
Sure. So I discovered King when I was about 13 years old. I discovered him through The Shining. I had started writing when I was about 9 or 8 years old, but I didn't really become a reader until I met King and met his work. I seemed to want to read, but every book I picked up, I just could never finish it. I was a very energetic child, so sitting down and reading was kind of not really in my wheelhouse. And then my dad recommended Stephen King. He says I read a lot of his books when I was your age, and we had this bookstore temporarily in my hometown, and had every copy of King's book at that moment in time, which is about 2003. And I thought, I've heard of The Shining. I know it's a film, so it must be really popular. It means it must be really good. So I bought that. I read it over the summer at the North Coast, and it opened my mind in a way that I'd never thought possible. Like, I didn't think you could write stories like that. I suppose it was a very naive way of thinking, but Jack Torrance, the character in that resonated with me because any other author would have made him completely the bad guy. He would be completely the bad guy in that book, but he's not. He's so complicated. He loves his family, he cares his family, but he has so many flaws with his anger and with his drinking and his alcoholism and all this stuff, and that is new and played on by the hotel to take over him. I just loved that. It made me think about characters in a way that I'd never thought of before, and it just captured me in a way that no story has ever done. After that, I just kind of read everything by King for a good couple of years, and then I looked up everything that had inspired King and read all of that.
It's just so awesome. And you had a King blog, yes, on your website where you kind of reviewed everything?
I did. I called it The Books That Shine. I decided, because when I read King, it was kind of like shotgun. It was like, I'd take a book off the shelf and thought, that sounds good, I'll read it. But it always kind of bugged me that I never read them in publication order because I thought that there was maybe something special about reading them. So a couple of years ago, I decided I'm going to do this. I'm going to chronologically reread everything that he's read or written, and started with Carrie. And that was actually, I had just recently reread The Shining at the Stanley Hotel. That's what spurred that on. It's just sort of this, why not? So I went back, started with Carrie, and then I just found myself, I didn't really review books back then, but I saw a lot of people doing Instagram, and I just started doing it, and I was always comparing it to my personal experience of the book throughout my life, because I've reread most of them. And I funny when I pick up one of them, I can remember where I read that book last, like how old I was, what house it was in, my grandmother's, whatever. So it's like a nostalgic trip for me reading those words. So I just started to do reviews, and then I just started to, and I noticed that I started to rank the books, and I would have tiers. So books that shine was the top tier. These were like books that were just blew your mind. They were exceptional, and then there was different tiers of different names. I can't remember them now, and that's it.
Oh, thank you, Jamie. Man, like I said, you're one of my favorite king people. I just think that there are really smart king people, and then there are genius level, and that's where you are at personally.
Far too kind, far too kind. I'm just a nerd. They're just, I don't know. It is very strange when you think about like a 13-year-old kid growing up in Northern Ireland connects so well to someone who was a 50-year-old man at the time writing books set in Maine. It's just so weird, but I just connected so well. He just writes people so well that I know those people. I know them, you know?
Very nice. All right. Well, I'm thrilled to have you with me as my guest today because we are talking about a novel that I just finished it for the second time. And I really think I love this book, Jamie. I
Mhm.
really, really like this one. And I am so glad that you want to chat about it with me. I just am so excited to hear your thoughts on 1995's Rose Matter as Jamie holds up his paperback copy. Thank you so much, sir. I love your enthusiasm for this one. For those constant readers out there who haven't read this one, because it sadly, I think, is underread in his catalog, can you give us a little bit of a synopsis? And also, I really enjoy your perspective on King's career and where he was in certain decades. I know you have an awesome segment with King Size about King through the decades, and there's a
Mm.
lot of great content on that. What was going on in 1995 and the Eclipse trilogy, and what is Rose Matter about?
Would you want me to read the synopsis in the back of the book I have? Would that work?
We can do that. We can absolutely do that.
So for Rose Matters, roused by a single drop of blood, Rosie Daniels wakes up to the chilling realization that her husband is going to kill her, and she takes flight with his credit card. Alone in a strange city, Rosie begins to build a new life. She meets Bill Steiner. She finds an odd junk shop painting, Rose Madder, which strangely seems to want her as much as she wants it. But it's hard for Rosie not to keep looking over her shoulder. Rose maddened and on the rampage. Norman is a corrupt cop with a dog's instinct for tracking people, and he's getting closer.
Solid. Can't go wrong with the dust cover.
No, that sums it up pretty well. I think. Where was he at this time? So you've asked multiple questions there.
I did.
1995. The 90s are a very strange era for King, I find, because he's just come out of his 80s era, which was an era in which he got clean. He was addicted to cocaine, he was addicted to alcohol, and he got clean. And by the 90s, the early 90s, he was writing sober for the first time. And it's a decade of his life in which his writing style changes and his focus changes. I've always thought of King's earlier works as all being focused on the supernatural, the 70s and the 80s work. You've got It with Pennywise, you've got The Dark Half, you've got Salem's Lot vampires. There's a lot of opulent influences in his works that become part of them. And King, who wouldn't describe himself as a horror author, but has got the label of a horror author, started to move away from the sort of supernatural horror and kind of started focusing on human horror and real life horrors, particularly with these, as you mentioned, these Eclipse trilogy, this sort of unconnected, well, semi-unconnected trilogy of books that he wrote about women experiencing domestic abuse. And it's a lot more grounded and a lot more realism, at least the other two are, which are Dolores Claiborne and Jared's Game. And Rose Matter is probably the one that has the most supernatural influence in it. But even though these books in the 90s, some of them did have supernatural elements to them, you notice that the lens has changed. You can't say Salem's Lot, which is a book where vampires take over a town in Maine. The supernatural that can be compared to the supernatural that is within this book. It's an element of the book, but it's not the main focus. The main focus here is the human element, the character, Rosie Daniels, Rosie Reel, and Norman and Bill Steiner. And I think that's interesting. I think it's just maybe it was my interpretation, having reread them, that I noticed that at the time when this was happening when it was going through the 80s to 90s. There was a period of sort of insecurity in his writing. You know, he was coming off being sober for the first time, and I think there was a fear of whether he could do it sober. I know that from interviews. And certainly the novellas that you find in released in 1990, the Four Past Midnight novellas, there is a sort of like overindulgence in the writing and the length and things like that. And it's almost like, is he, second guessing himself in his style? But Rose Matter comes in the middle of the 90s period. And I didn't also notice something curious with the 90s stuff, was that each book felt like it could be three novels in one. Like they could be stripped out certain part because he seemed to talk about, especially books like Insomnia. It seems to have four novels in it than one novel. It's just so many topics he talks on about, like three little men that come and cut the soul lines of people away. As well, at the time, it talks about abortion issues and women's rights issues, and this man who's dealing with insomnia all in one book. It's like a lot. And I noticed that with a lot of King's books, and especially this one, Rose Matter, that has like this cat and mouse game going on with Rose Daniels, who loses her Daniels name and comes under a maiden name, and her husband. And then there's this magical middle section where she goes into this other world. And it's like, wow. I remember rereading, I thought that really, I struggled with that. It felt like these two bits should be pulled apart. Having read it for this podcast again, I actually really enjoyed it. And it really worked for me this time.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear it. I have found that is the case with the reread for Rose Matter. I think a lot of folks read it for the first time, and if they're not prepared for the magical realism and the fantastical, they digest it, but there's like a strangeness, almost like eating a food you're not super familiar with, and you're like, it's fine, it's okay. But then the next reread, there's a lot more appreciation for that magical component.
Yeah. It is a hard left turn he takes when he goes into it, when it's in the book, so you could understand why it's jarring for readers. But it does work. It works for me. It's interesting. It's certainly not what you expect. It's just kind of like his imagination just, oh, we're just going to do this now. And we go down this pathway that you would never have thought it's going down.
Totally true. Very correct. I did want to touch on Norman Daniels, who is our villain. It's Rosie's husband. And some of the criticism for this novel says that Norman is too much of a caricature. He's almost like a Halloween mask. His violence is so over the top that it's borderline comical. I disagree. What are your thoughts on Norman?
Norman's a really strange one. So we were talking that we read this together and we were bouncing, emails back and forth. And I noticed the first half of the book, I was really enjoying the Norman sections. I found them really interesting, and there was a ideal of threat there. And I wouldn't say it was a caricature, because it's just this really interesting element of he's a cop, and like he's supposed to be this person that protects and serves, but he has this diseased mind and this diseased mentality about how he views the entirety of humanity other than himself. He's so narcissistic, he's so self-absorbed, and everything is filthy and lesser and disgusting to him. And then you get to the second half of the book. Are we allowed to go spoilers with this?
We can. Absolutely. Feel free. I will warn listeners ahead of time, so let's go there.
So the second half of the book, it's like his entire world around him becomes his mentality, because there's an element. It was played sort of comedic in the book, but he goes and attacks one of Rosie's friends, who is also a woman who's been helped out by this women's aid service. And she dies by accident, not by his hand. She runs into like a coat hanger and peels on her eye. And it's like the world around him is like he emits an aura of nastiness and chauvinisticness and violence, that people just get hurt around him, not even because he's trying to hurt them. And that's where I could see like, oh, and a lot of the sections then when Norman become very long. I remember we were discussing back and forth, and like there's an element where Rose and her boyfriend Bill are back at her flat. It's the last bit of section of the book. It's the final confrontation, and they go up to the steps and they notice that the outside light is off, and then Norman attacks. But then it cuts, and you get this gigantic 15-page long section of everything Norman's done up until that point, and you don't need it. you don't need the kind of the lengthy sections in Norman at the end. You just want to get on with it. And in those sections, it indulges in the violence and the thoughts of Norman, which are like bile. They're just terrible, nasty, heinous thoughts. So, first half, I don't feel he's a caricature, but in the second half, Norman, I feel, becomes employed by by the magic within this book, the supernatural element, the same magic that is helping Rosie seems also to guide and push Norman in a direction for a confrontation. And it's almost like he does become a figure. He does wear a mask, as you say, and it fits on his head, and it becomes a face that it sticks onto him when he enters this magical world. And there's other things going on in the story but we are never given we're never given answers to, which I think is one of the interesting things about it, but it also might put people off because there isn't really much resolve for those questions.
I'm just hanging on every word, Jamie. I love your thoughts. I know that you and I discussed how Rose Matter is really a blueprint for a lot of other King works that we will read down the road. You mentioned Brady Hartsfield from
Yeah.
Mr. Mercedes. Let's open that one up.
Yeah, there's a section when it's sort of we're halfway through the book where you're getting to see Norman investigate, and it's him in a hotel room smoking cigarettes and mentally going through these things to look at new angles, to find evidence, to find where his wife is, and he calls it trolling, and it's what's allowed him to make hunches and assessments as a cop. That's allowed him to be very successful in his career. And it's kind of interesting because if you took the name Norman out and put Brady in, it would feel like Brady in Mr. Mercedes when he's sitting in his basement, thinking of all the awful things he's got be doing and hating against Hodges. It just feels like Norman is a blueprint for that type of psychopath, the kind of incel psychopath, this person that from the outside, Brady is a tech engineer and an ice cream man. Norman is a cop. These ideas that, people that would never cross a line, that the people that are going to protect you. Ice cream man is supposed to be this idea of innocence. He provides sweet treats and all this stuff. So it just kind of feels like it's a little bit, not that I'm saying Kling in 1995 had a plan for 2014's Mr. Mercedes, but you do, if you read enough of King, you kind of notice things move in a circle. Like there's even in, I think it's the Dark Half, we get a reference to an outsider or the outsider, and then we have a title of a book called The Outsider in 2018. And there's elements of that throughout King's work. He has these wee nuggets of ideas, and I think he does allow himself to go off in a kind of imaginative tangent where he doesn't know the answer, but it has a nugget then that leaves in his head and he has to expand it and he comes back to it in other works. So I think the type of character that Norman is we're seeing a first very raw version of that type of incel psychopath that Brady Hartsfield we eventually see in that character.
I love this connection so much, and I'm so glad you brought it to my attention because it was not on the radar. And now that it is, I can't stop thinking about it. I think it's really, really great. Another comparison I did want to discuss with you, I think that Rose Matter is really a seminal work. And I think it is a book that spread some seeds for future King works, specifically with The Dark Tower. But I caution you, I haven't read books 6 and 7 yet, so I'm so sorry. But thank you for helping me avoid any spoilers. But I know that the Wastelands took place in the city of Lud in Midworld. Yeah. And I believe, if I'm correct, Lud was not doing well. Like, it's an unhealthy, radioactive place. We have some Lud in Rose Matter. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a reference. It's sort of a passing comment that this character makes to Rosie Reel about how. But I was wondering if you remembered the sentence better than I did, because did she talk about how it was like decimated or something like that, or said about the quality of it being quite poor? Because I think it's quite clear. So the book of Rose Matter has the cat and mouse game of Rose and Norman, and as when Rosie's moved to this new city to have a new life, she discovers a painting she needs to have, and it has a woman on it depicted that kind of looks like her. And one night, discovers that this painting is actually magical. It's a doorway to another world, and she meets these characters that reference Lud in the Dark Tower. So, but I think it's quite obvious that these books are connected. The question is, when is Rose Madder in connection to the Dark Tower, to Roland's journey? Like, what era of time is Lud a fully functioning city as it used to be, as we're told it is, or is it the kind of, because at the end of the Wastelands, Lud's destroyed. The characters leave on the train, and nuclear bombs go off underneath it and destroy the city, so it's gone. But before that, it's like the scavenge city where it's like post-apocalyptic world where people are eating each other and there's all this violence and all these booby-trapped streets and things like that, and they all live under sort of a tyrant kind of regime. But we don't really get, we just get the word lud in a sentence, and it's sort of that. That's why I think people might be infuriated by that. If you're not like a big King fan and if you haven't read Dark Tower, you probably would like, what is this line? And then if you did, you would be like, well, what is he meaning here? Because he doesn't offer a resolve. He doesn't explain what this is. Rosie's connection is to this woman in the painting who turns out to be real. It turns out there's two women, one she can't look in the eyes of, and the other one who's kind of like this nurse character to this woman who seems to have a condition. And yeah, so I don't. I would love to ask him, and I bet you if we asked him, he wouldn't know. He wouldn't know the.
I agree. I'm sure it would not go over well. My thought is that you are correct, and I believe that this might be the nuclear fallout Lud, based on the fact that Rose Madder, the woman who Rosie meets in the painting, has some sort of skin condition. She is not doing well. She's not healthy. She's also mentally not super stable. She flies
Hmm.
off in rages, and she looks, I think it's not as dramatic as leprosy, but some sort of something is
Yeah,
affecting. And I don't know if her companion slash assistant Dorcas, who we also refer to in the novel as Wendy Yarrow, I don't know if she's doing well either in terms of health.
yeah, and the Rose Matter, she's a very interesting character because
Yeah.
in this read I caught a connection that I should have remembered, but because it was so staggering and it stood out. But is Rose Matter a Pennywise creature?
Oh my God.
Because at the end of the book, you get Norman's demise is at the end of is to Rose Madder, and we're told when our Rosie meets Rose Madder, she's not allowed to look her in the eye. Norman is not told that and does look her in the eye, and she becomes this spider-like thing, which we know is the final form of Pennywise. We also know that in I won't say there's more Pennywises. I can't say because I don't want to ruin your experience.
Okay.
But there is more creatures like Pennywise. Pennywise is a creature and a part of a race of beings, so we know that there's more of them in the King universe. So is she this creature? At the same time, I feel like the way that the book suggests to me, I feel like Rose Madder is Rosie real.
Oh my God.
Like she
Yes.
becomes that in the future. You ask me questions about like the seed. She gets pomegranate seeds from this tree that even if she touches them against something like through a cloth, her fingers go numb and they're magical, and she has to plant them at this. She feels she has to plant them at this special location that her boyfriend shows her. In our world, I kind of feel like that's like what our world will become, or like we're a mirror of the world, that she'll eventually become Rose Madder, and it's a circular thing where she will eventually, because she's been in this magical world, she was in experience this magical experience that causes her to live longer. I don't know, and become Rose Madder, and eventually meet her younger self again and help out, and it's just a circle that keeps going.
Oh my God, Jamie, I am like, I need to process and gasp more. I love that. I discussed this novel with my book club, and they had so many incredible theories, but nothing about the wheel of Ka. And I think that Rose Madder, this novel, alludes to Rose Madder and Rosie McClendon being sort of the same person, but we just don't know how.
Hmm.
And the fact that we are looking at a future. Oh my God, I love that. I'm gonna be thinking about that. I love that so
But
much, Jamie. That's rich.
when I read the first Dark Tower book, The Gunslinger, I always thought that because it had like things like Hey Jude in it, I thought it was our world, but like thousands of years in the future, and humanity had met this peak of society and technology, and then that had all crumbled, And that was my first read, and it kind of reads like that, I think, because The Gunslinger is such a book that he didn't really know where he was going. And in subsequent books, he was able to develop this idea of multiple universes and things like that, and it's other worlds mirroring stuff. But I always kind of had that impression that it was like our world, but centuries into the future, and we've screwed up, and that's the way it's going. So the Rose matter kind of makes me feel like that way because she encounters anger like Rose after the whole events of the book. The book continues on for quite a bit. I like it. It's the wee epilogue where you see Rosie through her life, and she seems to be really struggling with rage and anger and stuff like that. And you could say it's a metaphor for, her experience of having overcome this abusive husband that she's been married to from very, very young. And I suppose that's what King was kind of doing as a metaphor. But the way the book presents it, to me at least, it's kind of her experiences in this world. There's an expectancy for her to do more because she's got these tools, these things that she's brought over from that world. And so I kind of wondered if that meant she was becoming Rose Madder, because Rose Madder also has a problem with her anger. And she said, like, was it Dorcas? How do you pronounce it?
I think it's Dorcas. Yeah, you're correct.
Don't get her angry. Don't enrage her. Or something like that. Don't tempt her to lash out at you, sort of thing. That made me kind of, is that the case?
Speaking of the ending, before we move on to another cool topic, we have, which you touched on a little bit, this very interesting concept about seeds and planting seeds. And so Rosie has to plant a seed in her world. And is that a tree of death? Like, I guess I just wanted to know your thoughts about what the trees mean, or why she was pressured to make the tree, or yeah, I feel like I have so many ideas I spin out.
My idea is that she's like reciprocating the story to keep the story going. She has to plant a tree, and the tree will eventually be that tree that she goes into in that world. She's ensuring her own future and protecting her own past by planting that seed. I don't know if it's the tree of life, but you could say it could be a rose seed that grows, because there's this big thing about Rick King and his roses, these magical roses that act like sort of mirror images of the Tar in his Dark Tower series. It could be one of them. I don't know, and we never know. And that's the kind of infuriating thing about the book. It's you go on this journey, and really is a journey, but you don't have many answers. But he starts off as this book about this woman who's awfully abused by her husband in awful kind of ways and manners, which I always kind of block. I always forget. And I've read this book 3 times. This is my third time, and like some of the stuff, like I can't remember this, like the stuff with the tennis racket, stuff like that. I was like, wow,
Awful, yeah.
awful stuff. And it starts out very grounded. I think this is why the Eclipse trilogy doesn't really work, because the Dolores Claiborne and the Jared's Game, they're very grounded books, and this one is so supernatural. The elements in Dolores Claiborne and Jared's Game that are supernatural. It's an eclipse that happens at the same time, and two women feel sort of a connection to each other and feel a kind of kinship, and that's all. But this is like she is transported to another world, and she has to perform this task, and it's quite interesting from that point of view. So that's why I don't know if the connections fully worked, but he does seem to have this interest in the 90s about talking more about domestic abuse and stuff. I would always connect these three books with Insomnia. They all came out around the same time, and Insomnia has a massive part of that book. The theme is about spousal abuse and things like that in it as well.
Oh, I didn't know that. I have not read Insomnia yet, so that's really good to keep in mind.
Have you read Pet Sematary?
I have, yes.
There's a great Easter egg to that book and Insomnia that one's fun.
Oh, I love it. Okay. I am so excited to, like you mentioned, I feel when I read Rose Madder, there are so many details, like the Temple of the Bull and all of this Greek mythology, and you could really nerd out with it. There's like Sumerian and Mesopotamian mythology in here, like just wild, wild stuff. But yet, I'm so with you, Jamie. Like, there's so many questions and we don't get a lot of answers. So we're just kind of left with, what is going on? And like you said, this is like the outlier little sister from the Eclipse trilogy. It might not even be an appropriate moniker because Gerald's Game and Dolores are connected, but Rose is like something else.
Yeah. Rose is very something else.
I also, speaking of books that don't give a lot of answers, one of the people in my book club who's a big constant reader mentioned From a Buick 8. And this might be a little bit of a reach, but in the novel From a Buick 8, a mysterious male question mark figure
Hmm.
leaves a 1955 Buick Roadster at a gas station in rural Pennsylvania. It turns out to be a portal to another world where lots of strange creatures emerge from the trunk. It's kept for 20 years and studied. And somebody in my book club mentioned, did the person who left the Buick leave the painting for Rosie? And I just think it's wild, but what are your thoughts?
Going through my theory about how Rose plants the tree and becomes Rose Madder, I think the picture is given by Rose. I
Oh,
think it's left by her. I think maybe she paints it in the future or does something in the future and it allows her to have that access point. I think it comes from her. So I do. So that's my theory. But she doesn't express any desire to painting. But then if she is a being that becomes like semi-immortal and exists for centuries, I'm sure she could pick up the hobby.
I like your theory so much better, Jamie. I think that works. I think that works. And there's also such a, for lack of a better phrase, like a wholeness of self, like a feminine wholeness, this journey of woman, this journey
Yeah.
of a woman's life and potential. Like Rosie McClendon gets a really bad hand of cards the first half of her life. Like she suffers in an abusive marriage for 14 years, just devastatingly violent, terrible circumstances. And then she gets this awakening by going into the painting and meeting, in theory, a version of herself in the far, far away future. So they're
Mm.
all connected. And there's a lot of power in that. So I actually really think that your theory is a lot more solid and more poetic.
Well, I like that what you're saying because the reason I think Norman could be found as a caricature is because I noticed in the second half when I said he feels like he's been guided towards something. Norman begins to take on these tics and this way of thinking gets even darker because I feel like it's like he's like being guided to become like this example for like all negative male emotion. It's sort of like this chauvinistic I don't know, bull. He becomes a bull in some ways. This bull that's just running around this maze. He acts bullish and thuggish and like dim-witted and slow-witted and stuff like that, and driven by anger and awful impulses. I don't particularly like that kind of thought line but it's in the book because even Bill Steiner, who's this boyfriend who's lovely and really falls for Rose quite hard. He goes into this fictional or this fantasy world, and he sort of talked down to he's there's a Rose Manor views him both all men sort of as animals, and he's a good animal as he's described, and women are elevated in this book to this other side of things, this sort of so it feels like there's sort of gender kind of roles being played at here, but King again doesn't give us any answers. That's why I talked about that woman dying in Norman's presence. Like there's an aura of nastiness that emits from him, and it's like he's been infected with something. Some part of me is curious if it's actually Rose Matter that's infecting him to cause Norman and Rose to have this confrontation, to sort of like as if this confrontation, this Rosie standing up to this person that's abused her life, means more than just what it means for those two people. Like it's an event that maybe has an effect on the Dark Tower and the multiverse within King's oeuvre. So yeah, it's a very strange book for that. It becomes more of a cat and mouse game than you think. I was actually quite surprised every time I read this about how much of the first half is like I kind of my memory of it is Rose leaves Norman and you don't see him for a very, very long time and it's all about her life. But every chapter it does bounce back to him and what he's doing. So there is a real sort of sense that he's chasing her, kind of which is it's good for the pacing. I quite like it for that. And then it gets to the fantasy section.
Very nice. We've got one last comparison in the Stephen King universe that I feel shares a lot of parallels, probably the most, I think. And
Hmm.
that is 2006's Lisey story, what are your thoughts about what we have in Rose Matter versus what King brings us with the story of Lisey Landon and Booyah Moon?
I think that's a very good comparison. King has often written twinner books. He talks about twinner characters and twinner stories. And I think Lacey's story is the perfect one to put up against Rose Matter as the twinner because it would be the male version. Because in that book, it's the author who's Lacey's husband who has the power to go to Booyah Moon, and eventually Lacey gets it too. But he goes there for creative reasons. So maybe he is the better version or the right version or the more positive version of this kind of male mentality, whereas Norman is the negative version sort of thing where he's just interested in violence and power and domination. That's Norman. Whereas what's his name, the character in Niecy's story that is her husband?
Scott Landon.
Scott Landon. He goes there to be creative. He goes there to invest in himself and to heal himself and to give himself ideas that allow him to support his wife and his wife's family. So yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. I've never would have thought that myself actually, but that's very good.
Yeah, and then there's a sort of another Norman, not quite as sadistic, but he's pretty bad with Jim Dooley. Jim Dooley is the villain who is obsessed with Scott Landon's works. He thinks there's unpublished works and he's harassing Lisey until he eventually assaults her very violently. And then she has to go to Booyah Moon for that healing. So in a way, yeah, it's like Jim Dooley's the bull that gets destroyed in the painting of Rose Matter inside the city of Lud. He's like the Norman Daniels bull, a violent beast. And then I think the thing that's interesting about Booyah Moon, though, is there is a monster. We don't have a monster in Rose Matter aside from Rose Matter herself, I should say. Yeah, let me correct myself. Rose Matter turns into a creature. And in Booyah Moon, we have the Long Boy.
Yeah.
I think it's the Long Boy.
Yeah.
So each world has this monster that deals with those who wreck the balance of peace and who are violent beasts. And so, yeah, I think I'm trying to connect Jim Dooley and Norman a little bit.
I could see that because Jim Dooley is again, it's sort of it's the almost it's not sexual, but it's sexually focused or sexually charged, the violence that he does to Lisey, and it's this, and then also Scott Langdon, the abuse that he experienced as a child growing up with his father with this mental health kind of issues, this sort of undiagnosed schizophrenic kind of behaviors that it's inherited in their family. So it's both books are a lot about domestic abuse or use the framework of domestic abuse to sort of connect to this sort of fantasy world. Yeah, so yeah, as it could be, like I think they're perfect twinners in some degrees.
Yeah. I have talked to a couple constant readers who feel that Rose Matter might be successful without the magical part, without Rosie going into the painting. And after the second time reading, I'm like, oh, no way. Like, we need it. We got to keep it. And so I'm wondering, is the magical component the reason why it's so underrated? Is this hard for people, Jamie?
Well, yeah, I think it would because again, it's so left field. It's not something that's built up in any way. Like, yes, she finds the painting and she has this magical draw to the painting and stuff like that, but you're not really built up that because the story has maybe gone 200 pages by this point, and is very grounded. It's about a woman running away from her abusive husband and, the help she gets from the women's aid services and the friendship she makes and her sort of beginning to get independence because it comes at the time in the book where she meets someone who offers her a job reading audiobooks, transcribing books, and she also meets Bill, and she's kind of getting this bit of freedom for the first time in her life. So it's very strange why you would think to do that from a creative point of view, like to have this just you've been going so far, Norman is trying to catch up, and then you just go this other avenue into this fantasy world because it does become then this book about femininity and and I don't know the male version of femininity. I can't even think masculine.
It happens.
Yeah, yeah. That's the dad brain kicking in there.
There
The
you
brain.
go.
Yeah, it becomes this sort of building building of tension between masculinity and femininity fighting off each other, but it's not. I don't feel it's fully represented. It's not. It's sort of there vaguely because Norman doesn't represent all men and all masculinity. He just represents this sort of need to dominate, and then Rose. I don't really feel like she is imbued with anything that sort of makes her like this pinnacle of femininity in another way. She's just Rose. She's always remains just Rose. This kind of woman that's just caught up in things. And it's very unique in King's oeuvre, I'd say, and perhaps that's why it becomes sort of a die-hard fan thing to read because it's so strange and unique and interesting.
Agree so much. I have noticed that the more King I read, the more I love the weird ones, the more I love the challenging, layered, dense, confusing King works.
Yeah, it's not. He doesn't like. I love obviously like Salem's Lot and Shining, like Haunted Hotel, vampires. That's what they are, and it's great. But you also love these books like Rose Madder, where you're like, I am going on a journey, and it's not a journey. It's not from formulaic. It's not like I'm not watching, a movie made by executives that has to hit certain beats at certain points in the story. It's like, no, this is something else. It's a challenge to a certain degree, but a good type of challenge because it's sort of, that's what I like about these books. And it's sort of something you can only really achieve with reading. It's like this thing that challenges you is, oh, you think stories can only be told like this to, oh, by page 30, I have to have this section, this is not that book. This is not what it does. It's like it's just doing something different. It's doing its own thing. There's a lot of experimental things King was doing in the 90s. Like he wrote his first historical novel, like Green Miles in there. He wrote Gothic grief horror called Bag of Bones. That's in there. There's all these different things. He was kind of pinballing all over the place, I think, in the 90s, and it works well. And some of the stuff's really great. Like Desperation is one of my favorite novels that he's written, and it's in there, and it's this big sort of epic scope book, and it's not anything he could have written when he was when he was writing and publishing in the 70s or the 80s. So yeah, it's a good journey, and they challenge you these books.
I like that so much. With the Eclipse trilogy and with these three novels that are pretty much back to back in a way, and they're dealing with
Mhm.
domestic violence, do we feel like King wanted to focus on human horror, wanted marginalized characters such as women?
As I said, you could throw Insomnia into this group of three books. You could also throw Misery into this. I feel like Misery is very connected to these books in terms of what they talk about because Annie Wilkes is the domestic abuse. She's the abuser in that. Instead of being the abused, she is the abuser. But the relationship she has with Paul Shenldon is very similar to the Norman Daniels relationship to Rosie. It's just it doesn't last as long. The same for like Jared Skeam, the same for Doris Claiborne herself. It's all these books about domestic abuse or abuse to some form.
I'm so grateful for your thoughts. We're approaching the tail end. So I
Hmm.
did want to fade out on Rose Matter. This is a question I frequently ask in my book club. If you had the opportunity to be in the editing room for Rose Matter, if we could add or omit anything in the novel, what do you feel you would do to make it stronger, make it tighter, make it longer? What would you do as an author?
I'd shorten some of the end Norman sections. I would remove that end Norman section that shows him killing two police officers and stalking her house. You don't need to know that. All you need to know is he's there. He's
Right.
eventually worked it out. Like you've spent so much time in Norman's head at that point where he's eventually going to figure out where he is. I think even the scene before it, he leaves. In the scene before it, he kills the woman that runs Women's Aid, so he knows Rosie's address. So you don't need to see him like going there and stalking it and all that stuff. I'd remove that. I would if King was anyone other than King, I just finished reading The Fourth Wing tonight, so I did, which explains a lot about the mythology and stuff and of that world and books now that are being published, particularly fantasy books that are being published now. The lore is something that people seem to be invested in. And particularly myself, I love the lore of any story or mythical world. So I think I would encourage him to be like, give me some answers as to where this is in your, timeline, line, multiverse line sort of thing.
Oh, preach. I'm with you, Jamie. That is a frequent complaint of mine, is it's so good and I wish we had a foundation of lore. Tell me, why is there the Temple of the Bull? Why is it there? Why is it that there's all these Greek mythological elements floating around? There's all of these very sordid pornographic elements in the temple.
Mhm.
Is this just like a gross physical manifestation of Norman's subconscious? Like the filth of this character is translated into a crumbling ruin in this world. And so there's so many gorgeous details in Rose Matter, but I'm so confused because I don't have any lore that I just spiral on all these elements, Jamie. So I'm with
It keeps you
you.
talking about it, though. It keeps you talking about it.
Oh my God. I have to stop myself with the Rose Matter nerdery. So you've really indulged me so much because this was the book I wanted to talk to you about because it's just such a rich, decadent, weird buffet.
It is. I read this book, I think, the first time when I was 17 or 18. So, talk about talking about stuff that I probably wasn't ready to deal with, but I actually really enjoyed it. I was there for the ride because by then I was sort of reading the King books that I'd missed, which were all the weird ones because nobody talked about them. So it's like, I'll leave that to the end because everyone's talking about it rather than, Rose Matter. So I'll leave it to the end. Anyway, and then the second time was the reread. And I really did. I was one of those people who thought, nah, take the fantasy element and put it in another book, do that another time. Because I suppose when I was reading it, it's so unexplained. It is an unexplained thing, and it's like this, as you said, this Greek mythology, and there's this weird section where she goes through this church that depicts like all this violence against women, and some of the women look like her, and it's almost like the kids going through Pennywise's house. It's like a fear situation created based on her fears. Again, this is makes me think: does she become like a Pennywise creature?
Oh, that's good.
Fears and stuff to create it because she meets then the bull. Like that would be Rosie McDaniel's Rosie Maria's worst fear is like this bullish male creature that's following her around in this maze. We didn't talk about that section where she has to save a child and she calls it Caroline, which is the name that she wanted for her child Norman. Through his own actions, caused her to miscarriage and lose the child that she thought she was going to have. So she calls this child she has to save Caroline, and they agree to the name. It goes to Rose Matter at the end, and she looks after it. And it's like maybe that's her reward after this life of living. She eventually gets the child, her first child back to her. So it's all this very strange and interesting kind of things. You could just keep peeling back, and it feels like it needs this like a scientific dissection. This book.
Agree, Jamie. Oh my God, you get it. You get the power, you get the strange so well. I'm so glad you brought, yes, we forgot about the maze. My goodness, we forgot about the maze. We forgot about the baby. With the maze and the baby, I think you're absolutely correct. So in the novel, Rosie goes through the maze, gets the baby, escapes the bull, and then gives the baby to Rose Matter. And then
Yeah,
later on, when she returns to her world, she and Bill get married and they conceive a baby named Pamela. And
yeah,
so a lot of the gals in my book club says it was because she won the maze that sort of allowed maybe the spirit of that child to come through. So that was her prize. So I think you're dead on. Like she won the baby, and then Rose Matter was able to, in theory, I guess, that was the spirit baby for wherever Rosie is in the universe that's not Midworld or whatever. I don't see. Jamie, it's so wild.
yeah.
I don't even know how to articulate what I'm
No,
saying.
because it doesn't look like Midworld. Sure, it doesn't. It doesn't look like anything like with the Midworld we've seen. And but then again, we've only seen Midworld as this desert kind of world, haven't we? And that wouldn't be possible. It couldn't all be desert. There has to be jungles. They have to be, and we know they worship different things and gods and stuff. So you just don't know. It's such an interesting feat that he managed to pull off. I know you haven't read the last two books, but he wrote this series, and like any other author would be like, you can't finish the last book until you've pinned down the historical accuracies of all this stuff that's happened that centuries before your story even began. But like, he just doesn't. He doesn't write like that. He's not interested in that. himself, and that's not how he functions. Having read his stuff and read him talking about how he writes books, he sort of gives them three drafts, and that's it. He only spends so much time on it, and then he moves on. So we're never going to get that satisfying, historical textbook about the Dark Tower and the City of Blood and how it connects to Rose Matter. It's for Reddit to figure out.
Right? It's for us nerds to just try to patch together where our theories and thoughts with a stapler and just see if it works. I'm with you. I'm with you there, where it's never going to be handed to us.
No, and we didn't mention, and I did mention Desperation, but we didn't mention Cynthia.
Oh my God, yes. Please talk about Cynthia.
I love Cynthia. Particularly love Cynthia in Desperation. In here, she's kind of a much smaller role, but she's great in it, and it's just all her character. But when did that's what I kept wanting to know. When did this book happen? Because in Desperation, when she first meets Stephen, this guy that she sort of has a romance with, she talks about how she had an abusive past. She's traveling across the country. She's coming from California. Did Desperation happen first, or did Rose Matter happen first? Are they different Cynthias? I want to know.
Oh, good observation. Yes, I want to know too, because I haven't read Desperation yet.
What did I spoil it for you then? Sorry.
No, I have no idea. I just know it's in Nevada, which I'm excited about. That's all I know. But I remember speaking to a different constant reader about Rose Matter, and they mentioned, oh, yeah, Cynthia's in another novel. And I was like, oh, okay. So that's all I knew, is that she was in Desperation and she's got green hair, and apparently people really like her. So we must get some time with her in Desperation.
You do. I love her. I think she's great. She's really good. I always love the characters in King's books that are not the main ones. I seem to love the side characters most. Like I remember, like Matt Burke from Salem's Law is my favorite one of that series, and he's not the main one. Like I always loved him. So as I say, she stood out from. If you want, I'll come back on talk about Desperation till my heart. I
Yeah.
have great theories about Desperation. So I do. I think it's a brilliant book and really underrated, and I would happily, if I was the editor, say, give me another 300 pages, make that 1,000 pages long. It's so good.
Oh, it's a date. You're definitely going to be my Desperation co-host.
Cool. Just an excuse to reread it.
Yeah, I need to get on it. This year is our Dark Ladies of King for the book club, so that's the trail I'm on. But I rebel sometimes. So, especially, for example, we have to read Misery coming up. I love Misery, but at the same time, it's really hard for me, Jamie. Like, it is really difficult because I am afraid of being trapped. Like, that's a big triggering thing for me. What Paul goes through is my worst nightmare. It really is. Torture, being trapped. So I don't want to read Misery. I'm gonna have to because I'm the moderator, but I know I'm gonna want to escape to something else
Read it in
quickly.
the summer when it's dampened. It's the worst book to read in a cabin in the woods in the winter when you're snowed in. Like that's really going to heighten it.
Oh, absolutely. That's very smart. I will read it next to the pool at a resort and just really, really escape the terror of that book, because I think it's masterful. I think it's an incredible novel, but it really messes me up. So, Desperation will be in my sights, and you're my co host, Date. We'll definitely talk about it.
Sounds good.
All right. At this time, good sir, can you tell everybody out there about what you've got going on as an author and where they can get started with a Jamie Stewart text? What do you recommend, and what's going on in your world?
Well, I just published my sixth book, The Cult of Queen, last October. It's Queen, that's spelled Choiche. It's an Irish word for forever. It's a book about a young boy called Charlie Moran, who is the son of a minister in his local community. And one day he's coming home from school, he discovers that the cemetery behind his mum's church, all the coffins have gone out into the water, that the water has eroded the banks of the river, and they are now free, and they are falling over the coasts, the north coast, into the Atlantic Ocean. And discovers that later that night that the inhabitants of those coffins are not dead. They are in fact very much alive and very hungry. And they're back after 1,000 years of internment to wreak their revenge on the land. So Charlie, with his faithful dog, golden retriever Winston, a young girl he befriends called Nadine that's also part of the community, and his mum must battle against these creatures, this cult of immortal beings, led by a 11th century witch called Lucille Byrne to save his town.
Oh my God, well done. I love
Thank you.
this.
It was writing it was the most fun I've ever had in front of page or the laptop. It was half of the book was handwritten, so it was, which I have never done before, and then the rest of it I did in 2 weeks on holiday. I wrote it in 7 weeks. It was so much fun, and I had when I was a kid, the thing that got me into horror as a genre was Resident Evil. It was a video game series, and my friend got it. And one of the things we talked about when we got that series, when we got into it, was what would happen if that happened to our hometown. And I used to write fan fiction about that. That's how I started writing in the first place. But I quickly realized that all my fan fiction, all my stuff I was writing about, particularly in relation to zombies, was all similar to what I'd seen and read. So I kind of like, if I'm going to write about this subject, I want to write it and make an original story. So cut to 22 years later, my wife and I are driving around the coast, and we discover there's this beautiful castle that sits on the north coast. It's called TYOUSK Castle. It's this ruin. But off to the left-hand side is this wee church, this ruin of a church, and there was a wee river going around it, and I thought, what if the river eroded the banks and the coffins got in the water? What if what it was inside the coffins was still alive? And that was it. I had my story. I had this desire that I always wanted to fulfill. I could, and I wrote the first chapter like the next week, and that was it.
Oh, it was ready. It was ready to be born. I love
Yeah.
this. I'm
hmm
so glad that it came out so easily and you had so much joy. That's the mark of something special for sure.
hmm It was also inspired by King because I was reading a book by Roland Kelly called Irish Folklore, and I read all the book and I enjoyed it. It was these short stories set in Ireland, and discovered that he is actually from Texas. And I was thinking, well, if he can write about Irish horror and Irish folklore, and I live here and I've grown up here, why can't I? Why can't I do what King did with his home state of Maine and set horror stories in Ireland, and then use that as a kind of device to talk about what it was like growing up in Ireland? So when I had this idea, I thought, well, I'll make Charlie 12 and I'll set it in 2002 when I was 12. So Charlie likes a lot of things I like. He's currently reading The Stand by Stephen King. His favorite band is the Red Hot Chili Peppers because they've just released By the Way. He plays Pokemon Gold, all those things. So I was able to pepper the book with all those kind of touchstones of my life. And then it just opened up this avenue to talk about growing up, with him. The book is not a YA fiction. It's the same way that it is not a YA fiction. It's kids. The main character is a 12-year-old boy, but he's threatened in the same way as anyone would be about the situation. But the interesting thing about it was that he's a nerd. He's and he feels very conscientious of that. He's a friend, a boy he's grown up with called Justin, who has gone to a separate school from him. They've gone into two separate secondary schools, and now Justin suddenly isn't interested in the same things Charlie is. In fact, he looks down on Charlie for liking those things like horror movies and Stephen King, and it begins to make him feel like there's something wrong with him, that there's a level of, like, I don't know, there's just a level of, he thinks he's maybe a bit weird and freakish and all the stuff for liking what he likes, but it's actually the stuff he likes and his personality that allow him to save the town. And that's what I
Oh.
liked. It's about self-acceptance, and it's a really fun, just great, well-paced novel that is my current release. And it seems to be people that read it seem to be really enjoying it.
Oh, I'm so glad. I will make sure to have your links in the show notes.
Mm.
And where can people get your books at?
They can get them all on Amazon. There's 6 books, and there's several short stories all available to download or buy, paperback or hardback.
Very nice. Are you taking a little break from writing? Is there going to be a sequel?
There's last few years I pushed myself to publish every year, and I have done for 6 years. This year I'm not pushing myself to publish or self-publish this year. This year I'm looking at literary agents. I feel like I've reached that point with my writing that I am comfortable and capable of getting it traditionally published, so I'm going to start reaching out to them with my next novel. However, I immediately wrote the sequel to Charlie's The Cult of Queen after I finished writing it. So it's finished, and I've written half of a third of a third book, and I intend to keep the series going, but I will continue. At this moment in time, I'm planning on self-publishing that series.
Very, very nice. Oh, I'm glad. It sounds wonderful. I'm definitely going to indulge. And I know folks out there, this sounds like every story that people need right now. Like we just need a wonderful escapist young hero to
Yeah.
help us cope with reality. So it sounds incredible.
Yeah, I discovered I never read them when I was a kid, but I discovered Fear Street as an adult, and I would read it. I've read it as sort of like a retrospectively, thinking my teenage self would love this, and I kind of like. But I always find that those books, there isn't enough teeth in those books. The violence is not hard enough, or the threat isn't hard enough. Because I was reading Stephen King at 12 and 13, where the threat is very much, adult. So that's why I wanted to write. I wanted to write a book that the 12-year-old Jamie Stewart would love. So there is danger in this book, and it's great. I love it. I think it's the best thing I've written so far.
All right, good sir. We are at the stroke of midnight. We're turning back into a pumpkin. Do you have any final thoughts or anything you want to share or recommend to anybody out there listening before we take our exit?
I'd recommend. I would recommend Brady. I think his name is pronounced Brady Sandler. He is a drummer, but he also has started to self-publish his own books, and he has a series of books similar to what I'm trying to do with the Charlie series. Is that set in a haunted town in America? His first one's called Relic Myers and the Army of Hexes. Sorry, is the second one, and it's coming out this year. I had the opportunity to beta read the book for him. I'd read the first one, and I loved it. It's been the best thing I've read in months. It was so much fun. So it is. So that's definitely one to keep an eye out for. That is coming out. So it is.
Very nice. Well, thank you so much, buddy. When I get to Desperation, we will definitely have you back, but I hope to chat with you again soon on a different King title because I know you've read them all more than once. So I might need your expertise here down the road. I think I might need you for Lisey's story. I'm going to reread it a little bit later on this year, and this one is so wild. I call Lisey's story dissertation level King. This is graduate school King.
It is, and it's a unique type of King. I also think that King's writing style has changed drastically in the last couple. There's a rumor going around that he like no longer writes his books. I remember around in like the 2000s because his writing style had changed that much. Because if you read him from his get-go, like you read Carrie or something like that, he's so interested in the physical world surrounding his characters that he very well he detailedly describes it. But as he goes into his 90s period, I think around about Bag of Bones, it starts to really take effect. He's more interested in describing the internal mechanisms of his characters rather than describing their physical world around them. And Lisey stories when it really hits hard because it's a lot of that book takes place within the headspace of people.
Oh, well said. I like that a lot. That's a really solid way to describe what the hell's happening because it's so challenging. It's worth it, but it is a very polarizing King title, as you know.
Yeah, it is. But he has these great moments. There's a bit in that book I remember where Scott's sitting in a chair and Lacey's like kneeling beside him, and he's describing Maine's winter because the winter has moved in and it's like a snowstorm outside. I want to live in Maine to just
Mhm.
experience the weather because it's so crazy, and and the way the King described it, and it's so eerie and spooky, and it's like you think they're living in Hoth or something like that. The way
Yes.
that that's really, and that's like old King. He peppers those in every now and again with his new books. You get this a wee bit of description that's just like gorgeous and profound, and like, oh, I'd love to be able to just come to do that.
Oh, same, 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 same. Oh, thank you so much, buddy. I really appreciate talking with you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your time. It was great to discuss Rose. I think we did it. Did we do it justice?
Honestly, I think anytime people give Rose priority, she's winning. That book is winning. Like we need to give it some wins and we got to elevate and give it more publicity, more spotlight because it's special.
It is. Yeah, it is.
Thank you so much, Mr. Stewart. We will talk to you soon.
Thank you.
That concludes my Rose Matter Deep Dive with Mr. Jamie Stewart. I know you're all smiling like I am right now because Mr. Stewart always makes me so happy. I love chatting with him. He's the nicest, smartest King fan and has such an appreciation for the art of fiction. He's my kind of guy. Please make sure you're getting your hands on Jamie's horror fiction. I've linked it in the show notes, as well as Jamie's Instagram handle, so please give him a follow ASAP to learn more about where you can read his stories and stay current on all of his upcoming fiction releases. Okay, love bugs. Coming up on the Year of Underrated Stephen King podcast, I have some tricky decisions to make in terms of how to go about an episode on Gerald's Game and Dolores Claiborne. Okay, friends, wow. I finished Gerald's Game about a week ago, and whoa, incredible. I loved it, I hated it, I treasured it, I was broken by it. Clearly, emotionally, I haven't yet reached the level of simmer I need to for a solid analysis, so I'm currently letting things cool down a little bit, and in the meantime, I'm chipping away at Dolores Claiborne for the very first time. I have an idea to perhaps combine these titles and have a double book episode, an eclipse duo, if you will. Nothing is set in stone, but I'm mulling it over, so those two titles are on the horizon in some way, shape, or form. What's also on the horizon is a ranking episode. My buddies, it has been too dang long. I think the last ranking episode was 2023, which makes me absolutely sick. What is time? How could that happen? I don't know. Anyway, it's time to update and reshuffle some King favorites for the current 2025 record. So keep your eyes peeled for a ranking episode of my top 15 Stephen King novels. We're doing it. I am also hard at work on the Patreon, The Dance Macabre with Kim C. And for the bargain price of $222 US, you can hang out with me as I discuss Stephen King on film, Stephen King females, Stephen King short fiction, and much more at patreon.com/dancewithkimc. That's dance with an S. Right now, I am working my way through every episode of the Stand miniseries from 2020, and I think I'm having a lot of fun, ? Maybe not fun. Maybe fun is not the word we would use. It's something. Lots of ups and downs because, unfortunately, the limited series from 2020 did provide many slip-ups and misses, but I'm trying to find positives wherever I can. And now that I've officially finished the Stand novel, it is fun to indulge in what creative decisions were made. Although I am saddened that I'm a bit crankier than I'd like to be on some of the episode reviews, but I think many out there who have watched the series were just as pissed off as I am, so it's all very validating. If you're interested on my thoughts from the Stand limited series from 2020 that premiered on the Paramount Plus network, please head over to the Patreon, as I would love to have you, especially if you're hungry for a bit more Kim C coverage. That's all I have for now, dear ones. Many thanks to my friend Jamie Stewart for being the best Rose Matter chat partner, and thank you to everyone out there listening. I love and appreciate you so very much. Hopefully wherever you are, there's a little bit of spring, some flora, some fauna, and maybe allergies not be too terrible. Thanks again, take care, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.